The whispers followed Lady Alara Thorne like a shroud. They were the rustle of silk in a ballroom she could no longer afford to attend, the clink of porcelain teacups in drawing rooms from which she was now excluded. Plain, they said, a word as sharp and colourless as a shard of winter ice. Impoverished, they murmured, the syllables heavy with a pity that felt more like contempt. At 23, with her father, the Baron, gone a year, and his debts a ravenous beast devouring the last vestiges of their estate, Ilara was a ghost at the feast of London society. Her beauty was not the dazzling sunlit sort that captured immediate attention. It was the quiet, steady beauty of a winter landscape, the clear, intelligent grey of her eyes, the fine, pale sweep of her brow, the graceful line of a neck that she held high despite the weight of her circumstances. But in a world that prized vibrant roses, she was a sprig of heather, easily overlooked. Her plainest gown, mended with her own hands, was a testament not to her lack of vanity, but to her stark reality. Tonight the whispers were particularly venomous. From her position in the shadowed alcove of Lady Danbury's annual ball, an invitation secured only by the lingering dregs of her late mother's friendship with the hostess, Ilara could see the source of the evening's excitement. Alistair Vance, the Duke of Blackwood. He stood near the grand fireplace, a figure of stark, forbidding elegance. His fortune was immeasurable, his title ancient, and his reputation as cold and remote as the northern moors, where his ancestral home, Blackwood Manor, was said to brood under perpetually grey skies. He was the most desired man in England, yet he seemed to desire nothing and no one. Since the tragic death of his wife 5 years prior, he had been a phantom, emerging from his self-imposed exile only for the most necessary of appearances. He never danced, he rarely spoke. His face, a masterpiece of severe masculine beauty, was a mask of indifference. Dark hair, eyes the colour of a stormy sea, a jaw that looked as though it were carved from granite. He was less a man than a monument to some private, unknowable grief. Ilara watched as Lady Beatrice Croft, a diamond-encrusted viper with a laugh like shattering glass, attempted to engage him. Beatrice, who had once called Ilara friend before the Thorne fortunes collapsed, now looked through her as if she were part of the damask wallpaper. She preened and postured, her vibrant crimson gown a slash of colour against the Duke's funereal black. He listened with a stillness that was more dismissive than any retort, his gaze distant, sweeping over the glittering assembly without a flicker of interest. For a fleeting, dizzying moment, his eyes met Ilara's across the crowded room. There was no recognition, no curiosity. It was like being observed by a hawk from a great height, a brief, impersonal assessment before he moved on. Ilara felt a blush creep up her neck, a foolish, involuntary reaction to being seen, however briefly, by a man so thoroughly encased in ice. She turned away, focusing on the dance floor, on the swirling silks and happy faces that seemed to belong to another world. Her own future was a narrow, darkening path. Her father's solicitor, a kindly but pragmatic man, had laid out her options with gentle finality. There was a marriage proposal from a Mr. Crompton, a merchant of 60 with a lecherous gaze and damp hands, who was willing to settle the Thorne debts in exchange for a title in his family. The alternative was to sell the last of their land, dismiss the few remaining loyal servants, and take up a position as a companion to some aging dowager, a life of genteel servitude, a cold dread, familiar and constant, coiled in her stomach. She could not stomach Mr. Crompton. His very presence made her skin crawl. Yet the thought of leaving her home, of abandoning the people who had served her family for generations, was a pain just as sharp. She was trapped. Lady Ilara, the voice, low and formal, startled her from her grim reverie. She turned to find a man she did not recognize, dressed in the severe black of a solicitor, standing beside her. He was older, with a fringe of grey hair and a grave expression. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, bowing slightly. "I am Mr. Davies, legal counsel for His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood." Ilara's heart gave a sudden, panicked leap. She glanced towards the fireplace, but the Duke was gone. What could his solicitor possibly want with her? Had she committed some unknown social transgression by simply existing in the same room? "Mr. Davies," she managed, her voice a little breathless, "His Grace has instructed me to request a private interview with you at your earliest convenience. Tomorrow, perhaps, at your London residence?" Confusion warred with alarm. An interview? With her? I don't understand. What matter could the Duke have to discuss with me? Mr. Davies' expression remained impassive, revealing nothing. "His Grace prefers to discuss his affairs in person. It is a matter of some delicacy and of considerable importance." The very air in the alcove seemed to thin. Ilara's mind raced, searching for any possible connection, however tenuous, between the mighty Duke of Blackwood and the destitute daughter of a minor baron. There was none. It was impossible. Perhaps it was a mistake. Are you certain you have the correct Lady Alara? She asked, a sliver of desperate hope in her voice. Lady Alara Thorne, daughter of the late Baron Thorne of Glindermere, he confirmed, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Shall we say 10 o'clock? Numbly she nodded. There was nothing else to do. To refuse a duke's summons was unthinkable. As Mr. Davies bowed and retreated into the crowd, Ilara pressed a hand to the frantic pulse at her throat. The whispers of the ton seemed to fade, replaced by a roaring in her ears. The Duke of Blackwood, a man who moved through the world like a shadow, had singled her out. She could not fathom why, but a deep, instinctual fear told her that her narrow, darkening path had just taken a turn into the complete and utter unknown. The cold dread in her stomach did not lessen. It simply changed its shape, crystallizing into a single, terrifying question. What could he possibly want? The following morning, the Thorne residence in London felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. The threadbare Aubusson carpet was faded, the furniture shrouded in holland cloths, a silent testament to a life that had been packed away. Ilara and her loyal lady's maid, Agnes, had opened only 2 rooms for their brief stay in the city. Agnes, a woman whose pragmatic nature was a constant anchor in Ilara's turbulent world, had managed to produce tea and a plate of biscuits that looked painfully inadequate on the vast, polished surface of the mahogany table in the drawing-room. Ilara had not slept. She had spent the night staring into the darkness, her mind a frantic swirl of impossible scenarios. Was it about a debt she was unaware of? Had her father somehow wronged the Duke? The possibilities were all grim. When the clock on the mantel chimed 10, its metallic clang sounding like a death knell, her nerves were stretched taut. Mr. Davies arrived with unnerving punctuality. He accepted a cup of tea but did not drink it, his leather satchel placed squarely on his lap. He dispensed with pleasantries, his gaze direct and serious. Lady Alara, he began, his voice dry as parchment, I am here to present a proposal on behalf of my client, His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood. Ilara's hands, clasped in her lap, grew cold. A proposal? Of marriage. The words dropped into the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Ilara stared at him, certain she had misheard. The Duke of Blackwood? Marry her. The idea was so preposterous, so utterly beyond the realm of possibility, that for a moment she thought it was a cruel joke. She, the plain, impoverished Lady Ilara Thorne, and the most powerful, sought-after duke in the kingdom. There must be a mistake, she whispered, her voice trembling. There is no mistake, Mr. Davies said calmly. His Grace is in need of a duchess. He requires a wife to manage his household, to act as a hostess when necessary, and most importantly to serve as a mother to his son and heir, Lord Leo. His son. Ilara vaguely recalled hearing that the Duke had a child, a boy born shortly before the first Duchess's death. The child was never seen, never spoken of. But why me? The question was a breath of pure bewilderment. He does not know me. We have never spoken. There are hundreds of more suitable women, women of beauty, of fortune, of rank. Mr. Davies looked at her, and for the first time a flicker of something other than professional detachment crossed his face. It might have been a sliver of sympathy. His Grace is not seeking a love match, Lady Alara. He is seeking a partner for a practical arrangement. He has observed you. He is aware of your character, your quiet dignity, and your unimpeachable reputation. He is also aware of your circumstances. The solicitor's slight hesitation was more damning than any overt mention of her poverty. You are a gentlewoman of noble birth, intelligent and discreet. You are not, if you will forgive my bluntness, a young lady filled with romantic notions that would be disappointed. The clinical assessment was both insulting and horrifyingly accurate. He was offering her a position, not a marriage. The title of Duchess was to be her salary. The terms are as follows, Mr. Davies continued, opening his satchel and withdrawing a sheaf of papers. Upon your marriage to the Duke, all of the late Baron Thorne's debts will be settled in full. Your estate, Glindermere, will be yours to do with as you wish, unencumbered. You will be granted a generous personal allowance, and you will hold the full rights and titles of the Duchess of Blackwood. In return, you will perform the duties I have outlined. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. His Grace wishes me to be perfectly clear on one final point. This will be a marriage in name only. He will afford you all due respect as his wife and the lady of his house. He will not, however, offer you affection, companionship in the traditional sense, or his presence beyond what is socially necessary. His life is his own. Your lives, while under the same roof, will be separate. The cold finality of it stole the air from her lungs. It was a business contract, a loveless, empty cage, albeit a gilded one. She would be exchanging one form of desperation for another, the lecherous Mr. Crompton or the cold, absent Duke. One offered a prison of disgust, the other a prison of profound loneliness. But in the Duke's prison, Glindomere would be saved. Agnes and the other servants would keep their homes. She would be secure, and she would be mother to a child who, by all accounts, had none. The thought of the little boy, Lord Leo, was a small warm spark in the icy proposition. She thought of the Duke's face last night, the bleak emptiness in his eyes. He was a man hollowed out by grief. He was not asking for her heart because he clearly had none of his own to give. He was asking for a service. It was an honest, if brutal, transaction. With a clarity that surprised her, Ilara found her voice. It was steady, devoid of the tremor that had shaken it moments before. "Please inform His Grace," she said, looking directly at Mr. Davies, "that I accept his proposal." The wedding was a swift, sterile affair conducted in a private chapel with only Mr. Davies and a grim-faced Agnes as witnesses. The Duke of Blackwood stood beside her at the altar, a towering, silent figure in impeccable black. He spoke his vows in a low, toneless voice that held no more emotion than if he were reciting a grocery list. When he placed the ring, a heavy band of platinum set with a severe ice-blue diamond on her finger, his touch was cold and impersonal, lasting no longer than strictly necessary. He did not kiss her. He simply inclined his head in a brief, formal nod. Once the clergyman pronounced them man and wife. Ilara, now the Duchess of Blackwood, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air of the chapel. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a state of surreal silence. The Duke's carriage was luxuriously appointed but somber, the black leather upholstery smelling faintly of polish and disuse. He sat opposite her, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, the rugged landscape of the north unfolding in a blur of grey stone and wind-swept heather. He did not speak a single word to her for the entire 6-hour journey. Ilara, feeling more like a parcel being delivered than a bride, studied him from beneath her lashes. In the stark daylight, the lines of grief around his eyes and mouth were more pronounced. He looked exhausted, as though he were carrying an immense, invisible weight. She wondered about the wife he had lost, the woman who had inspired such unending sorrow. Was it love that had hollowed him out, or was it guilt? She found herself cataloguing the minute details of his appearance, the way his long fingers rested perfectly still on his knee, the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when the carriage jolted over a rutted patch of road, the utter absence of light in his sea-grey eyes. He was a fortress, and she had just been delivered to its gates, not as a welcome guest, but as a necessary piece of administrative furniture. As they drew nearer to the estate, the sky, which had been a pale, watery grey, darkened to the colour of slate. A fine, persistent drizzle began to fall, veiling the world in mist. The carriage turned off the main road, passing through a set of immense wrought-iron gates bearing a crest of a raven in flight. The drive snaked through a dense, ancient wood, the trees crowding in on either side, their branches bare and skeletal against the sky, and then she saw it, Blackwood Manor. It was not so much a house as a geological formation, a vast Gothic pile of granite that seemed to have risen organically from the unforgiving earth. Its towers and turrets pierced the mist-shrouded sky, and its countless mullioned windows stared out over the moors like vacant eyes. It was magnificent, imposing, and utterly devoid of warmth. A plume of smoke rose from one of its many chimneys, the only sign of life in the monolithic structure. The carriage rolled to a stop before a massive oak door. A footman, his face as impassive as his master's, opened the door. The Duke alighted first, turning not to help her, but to issue a clipped order to the driver. Ilara gathered her skirts and descended on her own, stepping onto the rain-slicked stone. The great door swung open, and she was met by a line of servants, all in stark black and grey livery. At their head was a formidable woman in her late 50s, with iron-grey hair pulled into a severe bun, and a posture as unyielding as the house itself. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and formal as she curtsied to the Duke. "Mrs. Albright," he acknowledged with a nod. "This is the Duchess. You will see to her needs and instruct her on the running of the household. She has full authority." He spoke of her as if she weren't there. Then, for the first time, he addressed her directly, his tone still devoid of any warmth. "Mrs. Albright is my housekeeper. She has managed Blackwood for 20 years. She will be your guide." Ilara met the housekeeper's gaze. The woman's eyes were sharp, intelligent, and assessing. There was no welcome in them, only a cool, professional curiosity. "Mrs. Albright," Ilara said, her own voice quiet but firm, "I look forward to working with you. The Duke was already moving away, his boots echoing on the flagstone floor of the great hall. The hall was a cavern of shadows and stone, vast enough to contain a small church. A fire roared in a fireplace that could have roasted an ox, yet its heat seemed to be swallowed by the sheer volume of the space, doing little to dispel the profound chill. Suits of armor stood like silent sentinels along the walls, their metal gleaming dully in the gloom. Ancestral portraits stared down from the shadows, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every move. "I will be in my study," the Duke said over his shoulder, not bothering to look back. "Do not disturb me." And with that, he disappeared down a long, dark corridor, leaving Alara alone in the echoing hall with a staff of strangers. Mrs. Albright turned to her. "If your grace will follow me, I will show you to your chambers." Her chambers, not their chambers. The solicitor's words echoed in her mind. "Your lives, while under the same roof, will be separate." The Duke was making it clear from the very first moment. She was led up a grand, sweeping staircase, its carved balustrade cold beneath her gloved hand. They walked down a long gallery, the silence broken only by the whisper of their footsteps and the drumming of the rain against the tall windows. Mrs. Albright pointed out various rooms in a flat monotone. The breakfast room, the solar, the family drawing room, though it is not often used. Finally, she stopped before a set of double doors. "The Duchess's suite, Your Grace." The rooms were opulent, furnished with exquisite taste, but like the rest of the house, they felt unused, unloved. A fire had been lit in the sitting room, its flames reflecting in the polished surfaces of a rosewood writing desk and a silk-covered chaise longue. The bedroom beyond was dominated by a vast canopied bed, its damask curtains the color of clotted cream. It was a beautiful, lonely prison. Agnes was already there, unpacking Alara's meager belongings, which looked starkly out of place amidst the grandeur. The sight of her maid's familiar, worried face was the first moment of genuine comfort Alara had felt all day. "The East Wing is your domain, Your Grace," Mrs. Albright stated, her hands clasped before her. "His Grace's chambers are in the West Wing. He prefers his privacy. Dinner is served at 8. His Grace will dine with you this evening, as is proper for your first night." The implication was clear. It was a duty, not a pleasure, and not a habit she should expect to continue. "And Lord Leo?" Alara asked, her voice soft. "The child, the primary reason for her presence here?" Mrs. Albright's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lord Leo keeps to the nursery rooms on the 3rd floor. He takes his meals there with his governess, Miss Finch." "I should like to meet him," Alara said, a beat of silence. "His Grace will inform you when it is an appropriate time for an introduction." It was a polite but firm dismissal. She was not even to be granted access to the child she was supposedly here to mother. Alara felt a surge of frustration, but she suppressed it. She was the Duchess of Blackwood now. She had to learn the rules of this cold, silent kingdom before she could hope to change them. As Mrs. Albright departed, leaving her in the echoing silence of her new life, Alara walked to the tall window. The rain streamed down the glass, blurring the view of the bleak, beautiful landscape. She was a duchess. Her father's debts were paid. She was safe, and she had never in all her life felt so utterly and completely alone. The cold truce had begun. The days that followed bled into one another, each marked by the same oppressive silence and rigid formality. Alara's life at Blackwood Manor was a carefully choreographed routine, managed by Mrs. Albright with brisk efficiency. She learned the labyrinthine corridors of the house, the names of the dozens of servants who moved like ghosts through the halls, their gazes always downcast. She took her breakfast alone in the small, sunless breakfast room. She spent her mornings in the vast, cold library, surrounded by thousands of books that seemed to hold more life than the house itself. She took solitary walks in the manicured, yet strangely joyless grounds when the weather permitted. The Duke remained a distant, enigmatic presence. True to his word, their lives were entirely separate. She saw him only at dinner, an excruciatingly formal affair held in a dining room so large their 2 seats at opposite ends of the long, polished table felt miles apart. Their conversation, when it existed at all, was stilted and impersonal. "Was your day satisfactory, Your Grace?" he might ask, his voice a low rumble that did not invite elaboration. "Yes, thank you," she would reply. "I spent some time in the library. The collection is extensive." And that would be the end of it. He ate with a focused intensity, as if it were a task to be completed. His eyes, when they chanced to meet hers, were shuttered and unreadable. He revealed nothing of his thoughts, his work, or his life beyond these strained evening meals. After dinner, he would give a stiff, formal bow and retreat to his study in the West Wing. a part of the house she had been tacitly forbidden from entering. The heavy oak door was always closed. More unnerving still was the complete absence of the child Leo. A week passed, and she had yet to lay eyes on him. He was a phantom, a whisper. She heard no childish laughter, no running feet, no sounds at all from the nursery on the third floor. It was as if he did not exist. Her inquiries to Mrs. Albright were met with the same polite stonewalling. "His Grace will arrange the meeting when Lord Leo is ready." Frustration began to curdle into a quiet resolve. She was not a piece of furniture. She was this boy's stepmother, a role she had accepted as the core of this strange bargain. To be denied access to him was to be denied her very purpose in this house. She decided to take matters into her own hands. One afternoon, under the guise of exploring the upper floors, she made her way to the third floor. The air up here was colder, the corridor narrower. She found the nursery rooms at the end of the hall. The door was closed. Hesitantly, she raised her hand to knock, but paused as she heard a low voice from within. It was a woman, speaking in a dull, monotonous tone. Elara pressed her ear to the wood. "And the cube has 6 sides, all of them square. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is a sphere. It is round. It has no sides." It was a lesson, delivered with all the passion of a ticking clock. There was no response from the child. Elara's heart ached. She knocked softly. The voice stopped. After a moment, the door opened a crack, and a thin, severe-looking woman with her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face peered out. "This must be Miss Finch, the governess." "Your Grace," the woman said, her surprise evident. She did not open the door further. "Miss Finch," Elara said with a gentle smile, "I was hoping I might meet my new son." The governess's expression turned guarded. "Lord Leo is in the middle of his lessons. His Grace prefers his routine not to be disturbed." "Of course," Elara said smoothly, not backing down. "I will wait until he is finished. I am most eager to make his acquaintance." Her quiet insistence left the governess with little choice. With visible reluctance, Miss Finch opened the door. The nursery was a large, airy room, filled with expensive-looking toys that were all neatly, unnervingly arranged on shelves. Nothing was out of place, nothing looked played with. And there, sitting at a small table in the center of the room, was a little boy. He was perhaps 4 years old, with a head of dark, unruly curls so like his father's. He was a beautiful child, but his beauty was marred by a profound and troubling stillness. He stared down at the wooden blocks on the table, his small face pale and expressionless, his eyes, the same stormy gray as the Duke's, utterly vacant. He had not looked up when she entered. He did not seem to have registered her presence at all. "Leo," Miss Finch said, her voice sharp, "the Duchess is here. Say good day to her Grace." The boy did not move. He did not speak. He continued to stare at the blocks as if the world contained nothing else. "He is a very quiet child," Miss Finch said, a defensive edge to her voice. "He does not engage?" Elara's heart constricted with a pain so sharp it took her breath away. This was not a quiet child. This was a child who had retreated so far into himself that he had shut the rest of the world out. She knelt down beside his chair, ignoring the governess's disapproving sniff. "Hello, Leo," she said softly. Her voice was gentle, carrying none of the forced cheerfulness adults often used with children. "My name is Elara. It's a pleasure to meet you." He gave no sign that he had heard her. His small fingers rested on a red wooden cube, but they did not move to pick it up. She was close enough now to see the faint dark circles under his eyes. This was the Duke's grief, given a small human form, a child drowning in the silence of his father's sorrow. She stayed for another 10 minutes, speaking to him quietly, telling him about a bird she had seen from her window, a squirrel that had scampered up a tree. He never once looked at her. Eventually, defeated, she rose. "Thank you, Miss Finch," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I will visit again tomorrow." As she walked back to her rooms, a cold anger began to replace her sorrow. This was not just neglect. It was a cruelty, however unintentional. The Duke, in his prison of grief, had locked his own son in with him. She had been brought here to be a mother to this boy. The Duke may have forbidden her his heart, but he could not forbid her from doing the one thing she was determined to do. She would find a way to reach this lost little boy. Her time of passive observation was over. It was time to take the initiative. Elara began her campaign not with grand gestures, but with quiet persistence. Every day she visited the nursery. She did not try to force Leo to speak or play. Instead, she simply brought her presence into his silent world. She would bring a book from the library and sit in the armchair by the window reading aloud. In a soft, even voice, not to him directly but to the room. She chose stories of adventure and magic, of talking animals and faraway lands, filling the sterile air with words of wonder. Miss Finch watched her with narrow-eyed suspicion, but did not dare to forbid the Duchess from entering. Leo, for his part, continued to ignore her. his focus remaining resolutely on his blocks or his picture books. But Ilara thought, or perhaps only hoped, that sometimes he would pause, his small hand hovering for a fraction of a second, as if he were listening. She knew she needed to find a different key to unlock the door to his world. The nursery, with its rigid order and the governess's stern presence, was a cage. He needed air. He needed life. Her search for a key led her to the grounds of the estate. One grey afternoon, while walking the perimeter of the formal gardens, she came across a high stone wall, almost completely obscured by a thick, tangled growth of ivy. In the wall was a heavy wooden door, its iron hinges rusted, a keyhole choked with moss. It looked as if it hadn't been opened in years. Piqued by curiosity, she sought out the head gardener, a weathered old man named Findlay, whose hands were as gnarled as the roots of the ancient oaks he tended. "Ah, that," he said, his gaze distant when she asked about the door. "That's the old walled garden, Your Grace, the late Duchess's garden." "His Grace's first wife?" Ilara asked gently. Findlay nodded, his expression softening with memory. "Aye, she loved that place, said the rest of the grounds were too grand, too formal. But that little patch, that was hers. Filled it with roses, she did, and lavender and all sorts of wildflowers. A right beautiful place it was. Lord Leo, he was just a babe, but she'd take him there, sit with him for hours on the stone bench under the rowan tree." His face clouded over. "After she passed, His Grace had it locked, gave me the key and told me no one was to enter, said he couldn't bear to look at it. It's been left to go wild ever since. 5 years now." An idea began to form in Ilara's mind, a fragile seedling of a plan. "Mr. Findlay," she said, her voice full of a purpose that surprised them both, "I should like the key." The gardener looked alarmed. "But, Your Grace, the Duke's orders were that no one was to enter," she finished for him, a new and unfamiliar steel in her tone. "I am the Duchess. I am not no one. I wish to see my predecessor's garden." After a moment of internal struggle, the old man's loyalty to the new Duchess won out over his fear of the old orders. He retrieved the key, a large rusted piece of iron, from a locked box in his potting shed, and handed it to her with a warning. "It'll be a wild mess in there, Your Grace." "A shame it is." The key turned in the lock with a groan of protest. Ilara pushed the heavy door open, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a scene of magnificent decay. Findlay was right. It was a wild mess, but it was a beautiful one. Roses, grown rampant and thorny, climbed over every surface, their blooms small and pale from neglect. Weeds choked what must have once been carefully tended beds. A stone bird bath was green with moss, and the slate path was barely visible beneath a carpet of clover. In the center of it all stood a single rowan tree, its branches reaching towards the sky, and beneath it, a simple stone bench. It was a place of profound sadness, a living monument to a love that had been lost and a life that had been abandoned. But it was not dead. Beneath the neglect, the structure was still there. It had potential. It had hope. This, she thought, this would be the place. The next day, she did not go to the nursery. Instead, wearing a sturdy pair of Findlay's gardening gloves and an old smock she'd had Agnes find, she returned to the walled garden. She started small in one corner, beginning the painstaking work of pulling up the nettles and thistles that were strangling a hardy lavender bush. Her back ached, and her hands, unused to such labor, were soon sore, but she found a deep satisfaction in the simple, repetitive task. She was not just clearing weeds, she was clearing away the sorrow that clung to this place like the ivy on the walls. She worked for 3 days, alone in her secret garden. On the 4th day, she changed her routine. She went to the nursery. "Miss Finch," she said, her tone pleasant but firm, "Lord Leo has been indoors too long. The air will do him good. We are going for a walk." The governess began to protest, but Ilara was already helping a silent, passive Leo into his coat. She took his small, unresponsive hand in hers. "We will not be long." She did not take him to the formal lawns. She led him straight to the heavy wooden door in the wall. She opened it and led him inside. For the first time since she had met him, Leo showed a flicker of reaction. He stopped dead just inside the gate, his small body tilling. His wide grey eyes, so like his father's, moved over the tangled wilderness. He looked at the overgrown rose bushes, the mossy bird bath, the bench under the rowan tree. His expression was unreadable, but he was looking, he was seeing. Ilara did not speak. She simply led him to the corner where she had been working. She sat on the damp ground and resumed her task of clearing the weeds. She did not ask him to help. She did not ask him anything. She simply worked, humming a soft, tuneless melody under her breath. Leo stood where she had left him for a long time. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he took a few steps forward. He walked to the stone bench and ran his small hand over its mossy surface. His gaze was fixed on the rowan tree, as if he were seeing something only he could see. Ilara continued to work, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. After what felt like an eternity, she felt a small presence beside her. She looked down. Leo was standing there, watching her hands as she pulled a long, stubborn thistle root from the earth. He looked from the weed in her hand to the pile she had already collected. Then he bent down, and with his own small, clumsy fingers, he picked up a single fallen leaf and placed it carefully on the pile. It was not a word, it was not a smile, but it was a beginning. Ilara felt a rush of warmth so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them away, not wanting to frighten him, and gave him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Leo," she said softly. For the first time she felt that perhaps, just perhaps, she was home. The garden became their sanctuary. Every afternoon, weather permitting, Ilara would retrieve Leo from the nursery, and they would retreat into their secret world. Miss Finch's disapproval slowly faded into grudging acceptance, as she began to notice a subtle change in her charge. The complete and utter stillness that had characterized Leo was beginning to thaw. He was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, less vacant, more watchful. Ilara taught him the names of the plants as she worked. "This is lavender," she would say, crushing a leaf between her fingers and holding it for him to smell. "And this thorny beast is a rose. We have to be gentle with them, but they give us the most beautiful flowers." Leo would listen, his grey eyes following her every move. He began to help in small ways. He would gather stones from the path and put them in a bucket. He would use a small trowel to dig in the soft earth beside her, his movements mimicking hers. They worked in a comfortable silence, a shared language of action, replacing the need for words. Ilara discovered that the boy was observant and methodical. He would spend long minutes studying a ladybug on a leaf or tracing the pattern of moss on a stone. He was not an empty child. He was a child who had been paying attention to a world no one else had bothered to enter with him. One afternoon, as a pale, watery sun broke through the clouds, they uncovered the base of the stone bird bath. It was carved with intertwined ivy leaves. Ilara found a bucket and filled it with water from a nearby pump, sloshing it into the basin to clean out the years of grime and fallen leaves. As the clean water filled the stone bowl, a small painted frog at the bottom was revealed. Leo, who was standing beside her, let out a tiny gasp. He pointed a small, hesitant finger at the frog. "Vog," he said. The word was quiet, slightly slurred from disuse, but it was unmistakably a word. Ilara's heart stopped. She turned to him slowly, a brilliant smile breaking across her face. "Yes, Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a frog." He looked up at her, and for the first time, his eyes met hers with a flicker of genuine connection. He pointed again, more firmly this time. "Fog!" It was a miracle. A small, perfect miracle in the heart of their wild garden. From that day on, the words began to come, slowly at first, like a hesitant spring thaw. Leaf, stone, bird. Each one was a victory, a testament to the healing power of the patient, quiet world they had built together. Unbeknownst to them, they were not always alone. From the window of his study in the west wing, a window that overlooked the walled garden, the Duke of Blackwood watched. At first he had been angered by the sight of them. He had seen Ilara leading his son towards that forbidden door and had been about to summon Mrs. Albright to put a stop to it. That garden was a tomb, a place of memory and pain he had sealed away. The sight of it being disturbed felt like a violation. But something had stayed his hand. He had watched as Ilara knelt in the dirt, her Duchess's title forgotten, and simply worked. He had seen his son, his silent, lost son, stand beside her. He began to watch them every day. It was a secret ritual. He would stand in the shadows of his study, a place filled with the ghosts of his past, and observe this woman and this child creating something new in the ruins of what he had lost. He saw Ilara's patience, her boundless, gentle calm. He saw the way she never pushed Leo, never demanded anything of him, but simply invited him into her space. He saw Leo's small hand reach out to touch a flower petal. He saw him smile, a small, fleeting expression that was like the sun breaking through the ever-present clouds. And one afternoon, through the thick glass of the window, he saw his son look up at Ilara and speak. He could not hear the word, but he saw the movement of his lips. He saw the radiant, unguarded joy on Ilara's face. He saw her kneel and wrap her arms around the boy in a gentle hug, a hug Leo did not pull away from. Alistair felt something shift inside him, a painful cracking around the ice that had encased his heart for 5 long years. This woman, this stranger he had married for convenience, had done something he had thought impossible. She had found his son. She had walked into the darkest, most neglected corner of his life, and had, with her own two hands, begun to coax life from it. That evening at dinner, the silence felt different. It was less of a void and more of a space waiting to be filled. Ilara, her face still glowing with the afternoon's triumph, looked up and found the Duke's eyes on her. Usually his gaze was distant, looking through her rather than at her. Tonight, he was actually seeing her. "The gardens seem to agree with you, Your Grace," he said. His voice was still formal, but it lacked its usual hard edge. Ilara's breath caught. It was the first time he had initiated a conversation that was not a mere pleasantry. "They are very beautiful," she replied carefully, "though some parts have been neglected." He looked down at his plate, a muscle working in his jaw. "Some things are best left alone." "Perhaps," she said softly, but with a newfound boldness, "or perhaps they are just waiting for someone to care for them again." He did not reply, but he did not retreat into his usual stony silence either. He remained present, his attention fixed on her for the remainder of the meal. It was a small thing, a subtle shift in the oppressive atmosphere of the house, but to Ilara, it felt as momentous as Leo's first word. It was a glimmer of light in the profound darkness of Blackwood Manor. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a fragile, tentative sliver of hope. Not just for the child, but for the man who was his father, and perhaps, just perhaps, for herself. The fragile truce between Ilara and the Duke began to evolve into something more complex. The glimmers of connection were fleeting, but significant. One evening, she found a single, perfect white rose, one of the first to bloom from a bush she had painstakingly restored, laid on the pillow of her bed. There was no note, but she knew with absolute certainty who had put it there. Another time, as she was poring over the estate account books in the library, a task she had taken on with quiet competence, he entered and, without a word, placed a cup of steaming tea on the desk beside her before retreating to his own section of the room. They worked in silence for over an hour, the only sounds the rustle of paper and the ticking of the clock. Yet the shared quiet felt companionable rather than empty. Leo, meanwhile, continued to blossom under her care. The garden had become his world, and he was now its eager apprentice, chattering away to Ilara about worms and beetles and the color of the sky. He had even begun to seek her out, his small hand slipping into hers with a trust that made her heart ache with a fierce, protective love. The change was so profound that even Mrs. Albright's stern demeanor had softened, her gaze on Ilara now holding a grudging respect. The progress they had made, however, was about to be threatened. A letter arrived one morning on a silver tray, its elegant looping script instantly recognizable to Ilara. It was from Lady Beatrice Croft. She announced, in a tone that brooked no refusal, that she would be gracing Blackwood Manor with her presence for a short visit. As the Duke's cousin, she felt it was her familial duty to make the acquaintance of the new Duchess. Ilara's stomach tightened with apprehension. Beatrice was the embodiment of the cruel, superficial world she had left behind. Her presence in the quiet sanctuary of Blackwood would be a violation, like a gaudy, poisonous flower planted in their gentle garden. When she mentioned the impending visit to the Duke at dinner, his face darkened. "Beatrice is tiresome," he said, the single word laden with a wealth of dislike. "She has an unfortunate habit of speaking her mind, particularly when it is unpleasant." "I am aware," Ilara said quietly. He looked at her, a flicker of something she couldn't decipher in his eyes. "Do not let her trouble you. Her opinion is of no consequence." But it was of consequence, Ilara knew. Beatrice was a link to the outside world, a world that would be judging this strange, sequestered marriage, and she was a link to the Duke's past, a past Ilara still knew nothing about. Lady Beatrice arrived like a storm front, sweeping into the great hall in a flurry of jewel-toned silk and expensive French perfume. She was followed by a mountain of luggage and a long-suffering maid. She greeted the Duke with a theatrical air kiss, which he endured with stony stoicism. Then she turned her critical gaze upon Ilara. "So, you are the little mouse he's brought home," she said, her voice carrying a note of amused condescension. She looked Ilara up and down, taking in her simple grey gown. "My dear, we must do something about your wardrobe. You are a duchess now, not a country parson's wife." Ilara met her gaze calmly. "Welcome to Blackwood, Beatrice. I trust your journey was pleasant." Her refusal to be ruffled seemed to annoy Beatrice more than any retort would have. Over the next few days, Beatrice made it her mission to undermine Ilara at every turn. She criticized the household arrangements, offered backhanded compliments about Ilara's appearance, and made pointed remarks about the Duke's reclusive nature. Her favorite target, however, quickly became Leo. She first encountered the boy in the main gallery. Ilara was showing him the portraits of his ancestors when Beatrice swept in. "Well, well, here is the little heir," she cooed, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Still as silent as a tomb, is he? Just like his poor mother." Leo, who had been on the verge of asking Ilara a question, immediately fell silent. He shrank behind Ilara's skirts, his small face pale. Ilara placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "Leo is not silent," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "He is thoughtful." Beatrice let out a tinkling, unpleasant laugh. "Oh, is that what we're calling it? Isabella was thoughtful too, I suppose. Always wandering off into her own little world. Look where it got her." The casual cruelty of the remark spoken in front of the child made Ilara's blood run cold. She saw the flash of pain and confusion in Leo's eyes before he buried his face in her dress. "That is enough, Beatrice," Ilara said, her voice trembling with a rage she rarely felt. She scooped Leo into her arms. "You will not speak of his mother that way in front of him, or at all." Beatrice merely raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "So protective. One would almost think you cared for the strange little creature." The confrontation set the tone for the rest of the visit. Beatrice seemed to delight in making sly, cutting remarks about Isabella, the late Duchess, often within earshot of Leo or Ilara. She spoke of her moods, her fragile nerves, her obsession with that dreadful, dirty garden. Each word was a carefully aimed dart, intended to wound and to remind Ilara of her status as a replacement. The breaking point came 2 days later. Ilara and Leo were in the walled garden, which was now a place of burgeoning beauty. The roses were blooming, the paths were clear, and the scent of lavender and damp earth filled the air. Leo was happily watering a small patch of pansies they had planted together. It was a scene of perfect peace. That peace was shattered by Beatrice's arrival. She stood at the entrance to the garden, a look of theatrical disgust on her face. "Good heavens, Ilara, you actually spent time in this wilderness. This was Isabella's folly. Alistair should have had it ploughed under years ago. It's morbid, dwelling on it." "We find it beautiful," Ilara said, rising to her feet, placing herself between Beatrice and the child. Beatrice ignored her, her sharp eyes fixing on Leo. "You know, little one," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "your mother used to hide in here. She would cry for hours. Sometimes she would talk to the flowers instead of to people. It wasn't right in the head, you see. That's why she went away." Leo dropped his little watering can. His face crumpled, and a terrible silent sob shook his small body. He looked utterly devastated, the carefully constructed safety of his world smashed to pieces by Beatrice's venom. Before Ilara could even react, a voice, cold as the grave, cut through the air. "Get out!" Alistair was standing at the garden gate. Ilara had not seen him approach. His face was a mask of thunderous fury, his grey eyes blazing with a light she had never seen before. He was no longer a monument to grief. He was a living, breathing storm. Beatrice, for the first time, looked frightened. "Alistair, I said, get out," he repeated, each word dropping like a chip of ice. He strode into the garden, his gaze fixed on her. "You will pack your things, you will leave my house, and you will not return." He walked past her, not even sparing her another glance, and went straight to Leo. He knelt down, an action so uncharacteristic that it stunned Ilara into silence. He reached out and gently took his son's shoulders. Leo flinched, but Alistair did not retreat. "She is wrong, Leo," the Duke said, his voice low and intense, meant only for his son. "Your mother loved you. She loved this garden. She was unwell. It was not her fault, and it was not yours." He then looked up at Ilara, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing pain. He saw the tears on his son's face, and he saw the protective fury in his wife's eyes. In that moment, standing amidst the ruins and rebirth of his first wife's garden, the walls he had built around himself for 5 years began to crumble. The shared challenge had forged an unwilling but undeniable alliance. He had not just defended his son, he had defended Ilara, and in doing so he had defended the fragile new life they were all trying to build. After Beatrice's carriage had departed, a heavy, charged silence descended upon Blackwood Manor. The Duke retreated to his study, the door closing with a quiet finality that felt different from its usual dismissiveness. It felt less like a barrier and more like the door to a wound. Ilara, after finally soothing a distraught Leo and seeing him settled with the story in the nursery, found herself pacing the floor of her sitting room, her heart aching for the little boy and, to her surprise, for the formidable broken man in the West Wing. Beatrice's cruelty had been a catalyst, shattering the polite fiction of their separate lives. He had defended her. He had knelt to his son, he had spoken of his first wife with a raw pain that went beyond simple grief. Ilara knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she could not let the silence reclaim them now. The door to his study was closed, but the door to his past had been cracked open, and she felt compelled to step through it. Taking a deep breath, she walked the long, silent corridor to the west wing, a part of the house she had never entered. The air here was colder, stiller, thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and something else, the faint, lingering aroma of sorrow. She stopped before the heavy oak door of his study and knocked softly. There was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time. "Go away!" a voice from within said. It was rough, strained. Ilara's hand trembled on the doorknob, but she did not retreat. "Alistair," she said, using his given name for the first time. The sound of it felt both strange and right on her tongue. "Please, let me in." A long moment of silence followed. She could hear the crackle of a fire inside. Just as she was about to turn away, she heard the sound of the lock turning. The door opened a few inches. Alistair stood in the gap, his face pale and haggard in the firelight. His cravat was loosened, his hair disheveled. He looked not at her, but at a point just past her shoulder. "What do you want, Ilara?" "I want to understand," she said simply. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for something. Pity? Curiosity? He seemed to find neither, only a quiet, steady sincerity. With a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he stepped back, opening the door for her to enter. The study was exactly as she had imagined it, a deeply personal, masculine space, dominated by a massive desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. But it was also a shrine. On the mantelpiece, above the roaring fire, was a single, exquisitely painted portrait. It was of a woman with a cascade of fiery red hair, a mischievous smile, and eyes the color of a summer sky. She was breathtakingly beautiful, vibrant, and full of life. This was Isabella. Alistair followed her gaze. "She was like the sun," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She could light up a room just by entering it." He gestured to one of the leather armchairs by the fire. Ilara sat, her hands clasped in her lap. He remained standing, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, his back mostly to her as he stared up at the portrait. "Beatrice was right about one thing," he began, his voice raw. "Isabella was not, well, not after Leo was born. Before, she was all laughter and light. She designed that garden, you know. Said the rest of this house was too grand, too haunted by my ancestors. She wanted a place that was just hers, just alive." He fell silent, lost in the memory. The only sound was the hiss and pop of the logs in the grate. "We were happy," he continued, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Or I thought we were, but after Leo's birth, a shadow fell over her. The doctors called it melancholia, a deep, unshakable sadness. She would have days, sometimes weeks, of light, where she was my Isabella again. She would take Leo to the garden and sing to him for hours, but then the darkness would return and she would retreat. She would lock herself away." He finally turned from the portrait to face Ilara, and the agony in his eyes was so profound it was like a physical blow. "I didn't understand it. I was raised to believe that will and duty could conquer anything. I told her to be stronger, to think of her son, of her husband. I thought I was helping." His voice broke. "I was a fool. I was trying to command the tide to turn back. I would find her weeping in the garden, and I would get angry with her for being sad." "Angry!" He spat the word out as if it were poison. "You didn't know," Ilara said softly. "You couldn't have known." "I should have," he insisted, his voice rising with self-loathing. "I was her husband. I should have protected her. Instead, I made her feel as though her suffering was a personal failing, another burden she had to carry." He walked to a small locked door at the far end of the study. Ilara had not noticed it before. He produced a key from his waistcoat pocket and unlocked it. This was her private sitting room. It connects to the master suites in this wing. He pushed the door open, revealing a room shrouded in dust cloths and darkness. This is where I found her." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. She took her own life. The full weight of the tragedy settled upon Ilara. It wasn't just grief that had hollowed him out. It was guilt, a monstrous, all-consuming guilt that had poisoned every aspect of his life for 5 years. "I sealed the wing," he said, his voice flat and emotionless again, the mask slipping back into place. "I locked her garden. I thought if I could just contain the memory, I could survive it. I failed her in life, and I've been failing our son ever since. I look at him, and I see her. I see my failure. So I stayed away from him too. I convinced myself that my distance was a kindness, that I would only infect him with my own darkness." He finally looked directly at Ilara, his defenses completely stripped away. "And then you came," he said, his voice full of a terrible wonder. "You walked into her garden, a place I couldn't bear to look at, and you brought it back to life. You reached into the silence I had created around my son, and you gave him back his voice. You did everything I was too much of a coward to do." He sank into the armchair opposite her, burying his face in his hands. The great formidable Duke of Blackwood, undone by a sorrow too heavy to bear alone. Ilara's heart swelled with an overwhelming wave of compassion. She moved from her chair and knelt on the rug before him. She did not say, "It's not your fault." She did not offer empty platitudes. She simply reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. "You have carried this alone for too long, Alistair," she whispered. "You don't have to anymore." He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. After a long moment, he slowly lowered his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, filled with a vulnerability she had never imagined she would see. He looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. He saw no judgment, no pity, only a deep, quiet strength and an empathy that asked for nothing in return. For the first time in 5 years, Alistair Vance did not feel entirely alone in his grief. The revelation, torn from him by the day's crisis, had not destroyed him. Instead, in the quiet, compassionate presence of the woman he had married for convenience, it felt like the first, terrifying, and necessary step towards healing. The confession in the study was a turning point, a seismic shift in the emotional landscape of Blackwood Manor. The secrets, once unearthed, could not be buried again. The shared vulnerability of that night had irrevocably altered the terms of their arrangement. They were no longer two separate entities living under one roof. They were two souls bound by a shared knowledge of pain. Alistair did not retreat back into his shell. The change was not sudden or dramatic, but a slow, cautious emergence. He began to join Ilara and Leo in the garden in the afternoons. At first he would stand at the edge, watching, a silent, uncertain observer. Ilara, sensing his hesitation, did not press him. She simply acknowledged his presence with a small smile and continued her work, allowing him to enter their world at his own pace. Leo, however, had no such reservations. One afternoon he ran to his father, his hands full of freshly dug earth, holding up a wriggling earthworm for his inspection. "Look, Papa, a wiggly!" Alistair froze. It was the first time he had heard his son call him Papa with such uninhibited joy. He looked down at the boy's eager, upturned face, then at the worm, then at Ilara, who was watching them with a gentle, encouraging expression. A complex mixture of love, pain, and regret warred on his face. Slowly, cautiously, he knelt down, mirroring the action that had so stunned Ilara during the confrontation with Beatrice. "So it is, Leo," he said, his voice a little rough. "A very fine wiggly indeed." He reached out and, with a hand that trembled slightly, gently brushed a smudge of dirt from his son's cheek. It was a small gesture, but it held the weight of 5 years of distance. Leo beamed, and the sight of that pure, uncomplicated happiness seemed to break through another layer of Alistair's defenses. He began to work alongside them. His large, aristocratic hands, more accustomed to holding a pen or the reins of a horse, looked clumsy at first as he pulled weeds or pruned the roses under Ilara's quiet instruction. But he learned quickly. There was a profound therapy in the simple, honest labor. In tending Isabella's garden, he was not erasing her memory, but honoring it in a new way, not as a place of death and sorrow, but as a place of life and continuity, a place where his son could be happy. Their evenings changed as well. After dinner, instead of retreating to his study, he would invite Ilara to join him for a glass of sherry by the fire. He started to talk. He told her stories of his life before the tragedy, of his travels, of his political ambitions. And he told her more about Isabella, not just of her illness, but of her wit, her passion for art, her terrible singing voice, her infectious laugh. In sharing her with Ilara, he was letting her go, not from his heart, but from the prison of his grief. Ilara, in turn, shared her own life with him. She spoke of her quiet, bookish childhood at Glindermere, of her love for her parents, of the slow, painful decline of their fortunes. He listened with an intensity that made her feel seen and valued in a way she never had before. She was no longer the plain, impoverished Lady Ilara. She was simply Ilara, a woman of intelligence, resilience, and a deep, compassionate heart. One rainy evening, he led her to the locked door in his study. "I think it's time," he said softly. He unlocked it and, taking a candelabra from the mantel, led her into Isabella's sitting room. The dust cloths had been removed. Mrs. Albright, at the Duke's instruction, had cleaned the room, but it was still a time capsule. A book lay open on a small table, a delicate shawl was draped over a chair, and a half-finished piece of embroidery sat in a hoop, the needle still threaded. It was achingly personal. "I couldn't bring myself to touch anything," Alistair said, his voice low. "It felt like a betrayal, but keeping it locked away, that's a betrayal too, a betrayal of her memory and of the life we have now." He walked over to a small rosewood writing desk. He opened a drawer and took out a slender, leather-bound volume. "This was her journal," he said, handling it with reverence. "I've never read it. I was too afraid of what I might find. But it doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to the past." He carried the journal to the fireplace in his study. For a moment, Ilara thought he meant to burn it, and her heart clenched. But instead, he simply placed it on the mantelpiece, beneath Isabella's smiling portrait. It was a symbolic act of acceptance, of integrating the past into the present, instead of letting it haunt them from a locked room. He turned to Ilara, the firelight catching the emotion in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "You have given me back my son. You have given me back my home. You have shown me how to live again." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. The air grew thick, charged with all the unspoken feelings that had been growing in the quiet moments in the garden and the shared conversations by the fire. He slowly raised his hand, not to her arm this time, but to her face. His fingers were warm as they gently traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing softly against her cheek. It was the first truly intimate touch they had ever shared. It was not the cold, brief contact of their wedding day, but a touch filled with a wonder and a tenderness that made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. All the loneliness, all the uncertainty she had felt upon arriving at Blackwood melted away in the warmth of that simple, profound connection. He lowered his head, his gaze searching hers, and she saw in his eyes not the cold, remote Duke, but Alistair, a man who had walked through the deepest valley of sorrow and was finally, tentatively, stepping into the light. The turning point had been reached. Their marriage of convenience was no longer convenient, nor was it just a marriage. It was becoming something far deeper, something real and true. The weeks that followed the opening of Isabella's rooms were imbued with a sense of quiet wonder. The oppressive atmosphere of Blackwood Manor had lifted entirely, replaced by a warmth that emanated not just from the fireplaces but from the people within its walls. Laughter, a sound the ancient stones had not heard in years, became a regular occurrence. It was usually Leo's, a bright, childish peal that echoed down the corridors, but sometimes it was Ilara's, a soft, musical sound that made Alistair's heart stir. On rare, miraculous occasions it was even the Duke's own, a low, rusty chuckle in response to something his son said, a sound that held the surprise of a forgotten pleasure. Their companionship deepened into a comfortable, unspoken intimacy. They were a family. They took all their meals together now, with Leo sitting between them, chattering happily. They spent their days in a shared rhythm, mornings in the library or attending to estate business, afternoons in the garden, and evenings in quiet conversation. Alistair found himself seeking Ilara's opinion on everything from crop rotation to political matters, valuing her keen intellect and steady judgment. Ilara, in turn, found herself falling in love with the man behind the ducal mask, his dry, unexpected wit, the fierce intelligence in his eyes when he debated a point, the gentle way he now had with his son. The physical space between them had also diminished, a hand on the small of her back as he guided her through a doorway, his arm brushing hers as they stood looking at a map, his fingers lingering over hers as he passed her a cup of tea. Each small touch was a question, a tentative exploration of the new territory they found themselves in. Ilara's heart, which she had so carefully guarded, had long since surrendered. She loved him. She loved the broken, healing man he was, and the kind, strong man he was becoming. She loved the father he was to Leo and the partner he was to her, but she did not know how to say it, and she did not know if his feelings for her were born of gratitude and companionship, or if they ran as deep as her own. One evening, a cool autumn breeze whispered outside, rattling the window panes. A fire blazed in the study, casting a warm golden glow over the room. Leo was asleep upstairs, and a comfortable silence had settled between Ilara and Alistair as they read in their respective armchairs. Ilara looked up from her book, watching him. The firelight carved his handsome face into planes of light and shadow. He was no longer the forbidding stranger she had married, nor the haunted man shrouded in grief. He looked at peace. He seemed to feel her gaze on him and lowered his own book, his grey eyes meeting hers across the space between them. He smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle murmur. "Nothing," she said, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. "About how different everything is. This house, it feels like a home now." He set his book aside and leaned forward, his expression serious. "That is your doing, Ilara. You are the one who brought the light back into this place." He paused, searching for the right words. "When I proposed this arrangement, I was a shell of a man. I saw you as a solution to a series of practical problems. A caretaker for my son, a manager for my home. It was the most selfish act of my life, asking you to bind yourself to a man who had nothing left to give. You gave me a home. Alistair, she whispered, you saved my family from ruin. I gave you a gilded cage, he countered, his voice full of self-reproach, and I locked myself in another right beside it, but you didn't just accept the cage. You found the one rusted-shut door in the whole damned fortress, and you patiently, stubbornly worked until you got it open. You saved Leo, and in doing so, you saved me. He rose from his chair and came to kneel before hers, just as she had once knelt before him. He took both of her hands in his grip warm and firm. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her. My gratitude to you is boundless, he said, his gaze intense, unwavering. But what I feel for you now, it has far surpassed gratitude. It has grown into something I never thought I would feel again. His voice dropped, becoming thick with an emotion that made Ilara's heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I have watched you, day after day. I have seen your kindness, your strength, your quiet, unshakable integrity. I have seen the way you look at my son, with a love so pure and fierce it takes my breath away. I have seen the way you look at me, with a compassion I have done nothing to deserve. He brought her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I know the terms of our agreement. I know what I promised, a life of respect, but one of distance. No affection, no love. He said the word as if it were foreign, a language he was just relearning. But I cannot honor those terms any longer, Ilara. It would be a lie. It would be the greatest lie of all. He looked up at her, his stormy grey eyes shining with a profound, vulnerable light. I love you not as a replacement for what I lost, but as the woman who taught me how to find what I thought was gone forever. I love you for who you are. Ilara, my wife, my Duchess, my heart. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, spilling over and tracing warm paths down her cheeks. All the unspoken hopes, all the carefully concealed feelings rose up in a wave of overwhelming joy. Oh, Alistair, she breathed, her voice choked with emotion. She freed one of her hands and brought it to his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. I love you, too. I think I have, for a very long time. His face transformed, the last vestiges of shadow and sorrow replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated happiness. He leaned in, closing the small distance between them, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of deep, reverent tenderness. It was a kiss of promises kept and new promises made. It was the sealing of a true union, a partnership born not of convenience, but of a hard-won, deeply cherished love. In the warm, fire-lit study, surrounded by the ghosts of the past who were now at peace, the Duke and his Duchess finally, truly began their life together. A year later, the walled garden at Blackwood Manor was in its full glory. It was a riot of color and life, a testament to a year of patient care. The roses climbed the ancient stone walls, in a profusion of crimson, white, and blush pink. The lavender bushes were heavy with fragrant purple spikes, humming with the contented buzz of bees. The paths were clear, the bird bath was full, and the bench under the rowan tree offered a shady respite from the warm summer sun. Ilara sat on the bench, a book open in her lap, though she wasn't reading. She was watching her family. Leo, now a confident, happy 5-year-old, was chasing a butterfly across the lawn, his laughter echoing in the peaceful air. His dark curls were tousled, his cheeks rosy with exertion. He was a different child entirely from the silent, withdrawn boy she had first met. Alistair was kneeling in one of the flower beds, showing Leo how to gently cup a ladybug in his hands. He looked up and caught Ilara's eye, a warm, loving smile spreading across his face. The bleak, haunted look was gone forever, replaced by a deep, settled contentment. He had taken to his duties as Duke with a renewed vigor, but he always made time for this, for his son, for his wife, for the quiet moments of happiness that now defined their lives. He rose and came to sit beside her on the bench, slipping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. She leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of him. He's happy, Alistair said quietly, his gaze fixed on their son. We all are, Ilara replied, her heart full. The whispers of London society seemed like a distant echo from another lifetime. They had mocked her as plain and poor, an object of pity and scorn. They had been mystified by the Duke's sudden, inexplicable marriage. But here, in the world she had rebuilt with love and patience, none of that mattered. She was not the plain Lady Ilara, nor was she merely the Duchess of Blackwood. She was Ilara, a beloved wife and mother, the cherished heart of her family. Later that evening, after Leo was tucked into bed, Alistair led her not to the study but up the grand staircase to the west wing. He opened the door to what had once been the master suite, the rooms that had been sealed for 5 years. They had been completely redecorated, the heavy, dark furniture was gone, replaced with lighter pieces, the colors were warm and inviting. It was a space that looked to the future, not the past. "I believe it is past time the Duke and Duchess had a shared bedroom," he said, a playful glint in his eyes. He swept her up into his arms and she let out a delighted gasp, wrapping her arms around his neck. He carried her across the threshold, their new life stretching out before them, as bright and full of promise as the garden in the summer sun. The shadows of Blackwood Manor had finally been vanquished, not by forgetting the past, but by embracing it, healing it, and allowing it to become the foundation for a future built on a love that was stronger and more resilient than they could ever have imagined. The most desired duke in England had found his home, not in his title or his wealth, but in the heart of the woman the world had overlooked, the woman he was now and would forever be proud to call his Duchess. Dear listener, the story of Ilara and Alistair is more than just a tale of a forgotten garden and a lonely duke. It is a powerful reminder that the greatest strength is often the quietest. In a world that so often values the loud, the brilliant, and the immediately impressive, we can sometimes forget the profound impact of patient, consistent compassion. Ilara did not win Alistair's heart with a grand gesture or a dazzling display. She won it by quietly tending to the neglected corners of his world, his son, his home, and eventually his grief. She saw the pain behind the cold facade and chose to offer warmth, not judgment. She saw a wasteland and chose to plant a garden. How often in our own lives do we encounter people who, like the Duke, have built walls around their hearts? They may seem distant, cold, or difficult. It is easy to turn away from them, to dismiss them as lost causes. But Ilara's story challenges us to look closer. It asks us to consider that behind the thorns of a difficult personality may be a history of pain we cannot see. It reminds us that sometimes the most transformative act we can perform is simply to show up consistently and kindly and offer a space of safety and acceptance. It is the steady, quiet work of pulling up the weeds of misunderstanding one by one. This story also speaks to the nature of our own inner worth. Ilara was dismissed by society as plain and poor. Her value was measured by the most superficial of standards. Yet her true worth lay in her character, her resilience, her intelligence, her integrity, and her boundless capacity for empathy. These are qualities that do not glitter, but they are the ones that truly endure. They are the bedrock upon which real, lasting connections are built. Never let the world's shallow judgments define your value. Your quiet strength, your gentle heart, your unwavering integrity, these are your true treasures. Like Ilara, you may be the one person with the unique key to unlock a forgotten garden in someone else's life, or even in your own, and in the patient work of tending to that garden, you may just find you are cultivating your own greatest happiness. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of the power of quiet compassion. Your support allows us to continue bringing stories like this to life. Until next time.